Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We've got a big crowd, so we're going to give it another minute or so. A colleague I work with says you should always give people 3 minutes grace to join meetings, especially in the new, when everyone is Zooms back to back to back. Give people a moment to catch their breath in between. Hopefully everyone is having a lovely day. I think we've got people spanning early morning all the way into late evening. So wherever you are, thank you for joining us. As we're waiting to get started, sorry, I should have introduced myself. I'm Diana Rollman. I am an associate professor at Oregon State University in our Superfund Research Center. At this point, you may have noticed everyone's been muted as you came in. For the first part of this webinar, if you've got questions that are coming up, we're going to ask that you use the Q&A box. So at the bottom of your screen in the sort of toolbar, there should be a Q&A box. If you're not seeing it there, there should be a button that says more, and in that you can then open up the Q&A. So we'll ask you to put questions in the Q&A. When we do hit that part of the webinar, you will be able to unmute and ask questions verbally if you would like to do so. All right. We are, well, where I am, 10:04, where anyone else is, maybe a little bit later. So again, thank you all so much for joining. Hopefully, we saw all the comments that you put in your registration, so hopefully we're able to address a lot of that. To get us started, I'm very excited to introduce Chance, who is going to sort of give us a welcome and an opening for this webinar. Thank you, Chance.
No, thank you, and thank you all for joining us. It's great to see this many folks coming together and discussing these issues. My name's Chance. I'm an enrolled member of the United Tribe of Wisconsin. I'm also a Oglala Lakota, and I'm the Director of Tribal Relations here at Oregon State University. And on behalf of Oregon State University, I do want to say thank you all for joining us and welcome to our data sovereignty workshop. Um, I'm often asked to do a land acknowledgement of sorts, and it's important to do that, but in the back of my mind, I'm always like, we could do more. We could do more than just words. Um, and so for today, for whatever time zone you're in, I'm going to say this morning because it's 10 a.m. here, but for the next hour, hour and a half, I mean, I think the discussions that we're having are going to be in the spirit of doing more than just a land acknowledgement. I think that's really important. I would imagine most of you that are joining us either work with or around institutions that have conducted research that have a legacy of, frankly, causing a lot of harm to Indigenous communities, conducting research without informed consent, and then gathering and disseminating data in ways that might actually cause physical, emotional, or spiritual harm. Um, and so I do want to take a moment to just give thanks, if I may, can give thanks for first of all, for our families and our friends, for our health, give thanks together and share this space and share our experiences and share our perspectives, and give thanks for an opportunity to do better. Because I believe that's why we're all here. We're in the business of doing better and undoing the legacies of the places that we stand, and do so in ways that empower Indigenous communities rather than taking away. And so, with that, I just want to say thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Diana, who kind of spearheaded this project, and I'm really excited to hear from a lot of the folks in the room right now. And with that, I'm going to be quiet for the most part because there's a lot of expertise in the room, and I think this is a moment where we can come together and troubleshoot and share our experiences, and hopefully tomorrow we can undo some of the legacies where we live, frankly. So thank you, and I'm gonna turn this back over to Diana.
Thank you so much, Chance. I also want to introduce Jamie Donatuto. I've had the privilege of getting to work with Jamie. I think we try to do the math every time. I think it goes back to like 2013. I don't know. It's been a lovely partnership and friendship. But huge thanks as well to Jamie for pulling this together. And like Chance said, now I get to sit back and become a learner with everyone else. So I will turn this over to Will and Patrick. I'll let you both introduce yourselves in the manner in which you choose. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, go ahead, Patrick. So it's Jay Stongo, Patrick Gostin, Freeland, Jeff Gidos, Alegro Logi, Homes, Moman, Casita Dawa, Homes. My name is Patrick Freeland. I'm Windclan from the Muskogee Nation of Oklahoma. I currently serve as a tribal liaison with the affiliated tribes, Northwest Indians, and in co-op with the Northwest Center and Bureau of Indian Affairs Tribal Community Resilience Program. I've been in service to the Northwest Indian College slash AHEC slash Lummi slash Swinomish IRB for about 10 years, give or take, and served as faculty, just kind of in that same space, walking that convergence of kind of indigenous knowledges, education, but all towards the advancing sovereignty, nation rebuilding, and community wellness.
Yeah, thank you,
Oh,
Patrick. Yeah. Oki Nixo Coax, Nisto Nitaniko, Will McCoy Samina, Itamik Siskanatoni. Good morning, everyone. My name is Will McCoy Samina. I am a member of the Blackfeet Nation in Montana, and I'm excited to be spending some time with you this morning. And I currently work as an assistant a professor at Western Washington University in education leadership and sit on chairs of many doctoral students. And we have Indigenous students who are in our program, and they often will be working directly with Northwest Indian College's IRB through reliance agreements. And I myself have a story that I'll tell a little bit later about my experiences working through my doctoral degree at Western and also having a reliance agreement with with NWIC. So with that, we'll get started. Patrick, I think we're going to talk about just tribal sovereignty to begin with, and I've written up a little blurb that I'd like to read, and so I'm going to read that to get us going. So prior to the arrival of any visitors to our native homelands of what is now known as America, Native people were thriving, living, and loving life, caring for the land, water, and sky with diligence and reverence. Native communities held their own governance structures, carried their own values, perspectives, and belief systems, and lived in harmony and balance with the cosmos. We continue to have self governance, and we continue to carry our own values, perspectives, and belief systems, and we continue to strive to live in harmony and balance with the cosmos. We had and still have our own education systems with complex science, psychology, sociology, medicine, botany, physics, navigation, and many other areas. We care for our communities and our people. We pass on education, history, culture, traditions, and religion from each generation to the next. We believe deeply in our communities. Relationships, respect, and reciprocity are important in our interactions with human and non-human relatives. As soon as the first non-native people began arriving, settlers began occupying land that had been the homelands of native communities since time immemorial. We have always been sovereign nations and following the formal establishment of the United States in 1776, sovereignty became the law of treaties during the treaty-making period with tribal communities from 1778 to 1871. Many tribal communities have special events honoring their specific dates of treaty making with the United States, honoring their continual tribal sovereignty, such as the Treaty of Point Elliott, signed on this day in 1855 by the Duwamish, Suquamish, Skokomish, Sammamish, Muckleshoot, Snoqualmie, Skykomish, Stillaguamish, Lummi, Upper Skagit, Swinomish, and Soxswaddle. And I think that that's just a really great way to introduce tribal sovereignty, thinking about from uh, pre-contact context to contemporary context, and all of the things that we brought forward that we maintain through tribal sovereignty, much of which has now shown up in treaties. Patrick, anything you want to add to that about tribal sovereignty in general?
yeah, I've got a little way of unpacking that. And I think before we get to that, Will, you had mentioned maybe a very clear example, in service of an IRB, and we can unpack the definition later. But give us an example that you've actually experienced with a researcher, coming from a tribal community, going through our IRB process and really kind of trying to understand what is an IRB first.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to tell a personal story about my own experience. So as a student at Western in the doctoral program, the EDD program, I was doing research within a local Swinomish tribal, within a local community, tribal community, and uh, I had all of the approvals from within that community, from the education oversight folks to the committee that is above that one and to the tribal senate. And so then I started working through the IRB process at Western, which is really about protecting human participants. And as I was working through this, the tribal community required that researchers doing research within that community also use the Northwest Indian College's IRB process. And so as a student, and I am Native, and as a Native person, I was like, why am I having to do two IRB applications, one for Western and one for NWEC? And finally, I sat down with a really wonderful human being, Dr. William Freeman, and we went through the NWIC IRB application together. And then it was like a light bulb went off. This isn't about me and my struggles and challenges in the IRB process. This is about being in community with this tribal community that's allowing me to be in their space on their reservation, working with their tribal community members, and honoring the relationship through accountability, making sure that I'm really preserving the data in a way that honored what their desires were and how they wanted to protect that data. And throughout all of this process, it was really a long process. A DMSOA was created through the legal department at this tribal community, and I've vetted all of the names and everything out of it. And I've provided a link to that DMSOA data and material sharing and ownership agreement that Diana will send out after the webinar today. So you'll have an example, a physical example of what a DMSOA might look like. And Patrick, I hope that I hit on the points that you were wanting me to.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I'll kind of share a little bit of a story. I was a first gen college student. I went to Haskell Indian Nations University, which is a tribal college. And we did a lot of work within, Indigenous and American Indian studies, and spent the summer working on research, but really growing up academically, professionally, and maturing with this sense of sciences and ways of knowing through an indigenous epistemology, through a very place-centered worldview, and with a sense of relationality. And a lot of my understanding of, say, ecology was from the frame of deep ecology, and kind of even seeing some of the aspects of what you would call a systems ecology. And so I graduated with a bachelor's and really didn't know what to do. But I'd had an interest in climate change, or excuse me, in environmental hazards, specifically, mostly drought, and how that was impacting communities in a sense that it was, having an effect on resources. And that was my initial perspective. And so when I went into graduate school, I applied for a master's in science in ecological sciences and engineering. Just jump feet first into it. Really didn't know what to expect. I came from an environment where I was very well supported, in a sense of truly being in good relations with one another, to this environment that was brilliant in the sense that I was surrounded by some of the most intelligent people doing some of the most groundbreaking research, exploring new dimensions of thought and philosophy. But underlying all of that, there was a strange discord in terms of worldview. One of the first courses that I had to take was about, research ethics, getting the city training, the different certifications, and, kind of checking the boxes, like literally. And part of this course was understanding the scientific method, that it was utilitarian in design, that it was positivist and inductive. And this is how you did good science. I also sensed something which I was very excited by at the time and really also willing to collaborate, but there was a very large interest in exploring working with tribes, particularly this idea of traditional ecological knowledge. Um, and my perspective of that term, came from what I didn't realize was a rather uncommon perspective. But I started to recognize from that utilitarian, positivist, and inductive lens that there wasn't the understanding the worldview required. There wasn't the acknowledgement of the perspectives of tribal communities. And particularly, there wasn't really this recognition of tribal sovereignty as more than something that you had to go through to reduce liability. Um, so in this space, when we would talk about ethical research, kind of a liability reduction aspect, we were typically talking about that framework built on utilitarian design as the greatest good for the greatest number. And the science as a practice being associated with it, the positive epistemology. So, like, epistemology means basically ways of knowing. But the positivism was the assumption that objective and value neutral knowledge exists independent of relationships. And the inductive reasoning was extracting data. It could be some kind of evidence, some kind of observation to relate to generalizable theories. And I learned also that that word itself, theory, doesn't mean, oh, here's an idea, here's a philosophy. It's literally an equation, right? Anyone that studied biology or ecology or chemistry, it's a function. It's a discrete and provable equation. Well, the implications here for tribal nations are pretty significant. So this utilitarian calculus will always marginalize indigenous peoples because of being a statistical minority, right? Greatest good for the greatest number. Well, already you have an asymmetry. But, and a good example of this, for instance, is demographic data. If you ever fill out the census, you notice, it's a bit different now, but it just, American Indians usually don't make the category. You know what I mean? And I think a lot of that's, people are afraid of complexity. It's like, well, if you're talking about that, like, well, what do you mean? Is it Alaska or is it, African or is it North African? And my perspective is, yeah, they'll broaden it, make it complex. That they'll tell you a lot more. But kind of going back to positivism is that it does erase in the scientific method place-based relational knowledges by treating all knowledge as context-free and universally applicable. And our reality is that we have many knowledge systems. We have multiple plural ways of seeing this world, of making understanding. We have this broad complexity, right? And the more that we try to simplify it into this discrete taxa, quite frankly, for the convenience of this idea of a scientific method, we're doing ourselves a disservice. It's not going to be the best research. And I think a big difference in this human dimensions aspect, and this is where IRB, Institutional Review Boards, come into play, is that it requires us as members of this board to really understand that where a lot of indigenous research and quite frankly, even like non-indigenous folks are starting to really understand that the interconnectedness of living systems as relationships are not resources. They are not sources of data or just simple observations. That nature then becomes relative in this sense, which is a significant divergence point in terms of worldview from this positive view of nature as material, made up of, atomic and quanta, discrete points that makes up our reality. But then there's also another worldview of nature as being constructed of meaning, right? You know, and that they're not, they don't have to be separate. And actually, there is a powerful confluence that can happen with these perspectives. And so ultimately recognizing that you have, it's be like looking at the world with one eye. Sure, I can see color and shape and form, texture, but when I have another broader perspective, now things have depth. And so this is, I think, the important understanding of not limiting the worldview, particularly in the sciences. So the difference isn't then just philosophical distinction, they're structured reason. Why research can, should, and must be conducted truly ethically in the sense of this common rule. Because without it, it can still cause profound harm. And there's a lot of examples in the past. Um, but research itself can cause harm to tribal nations when conducted without that ethical space and that ethical relationship with a worldview of relations. But the challenge also is that the framework itself was never really designed to recognize collective rights, to understand sovereignty as being more than just a socio-political framework, a legal status, but something inherent and something in terms of knowledge sovereignty, where it doesn't have to conform to a singular, taxified worldview. And quite frankly, I think more and more scientists are starting to wake up to the idea, with their plural knowledges now, that reality of knowledge production is always relational. And I'll stop there. And Will, I'll pass it over to you, and then we'll start to like drill down, into the legal aspects.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. As we were prepping for today, we had a conversation with Jamie, and we were talking about the application itself for the Northwestern Indian College IRB. And the Lummi Nation, who run the Northwest Indian College, they're Luktimish, and they have value systems that honor respect, reciprocity, and relationality. And they have very specific, I think there's 7 points or so that are on that IRB application that you have to address that talk about respect, reciprocity, and relationality. And it's not just with the people piece, it's with the cosmos, the non-human relatives as well. And the whole purpose of that is to think about research in a broader, more uh, broader and deeper way than most researchers think about research, and really think about the impact on all of those things, the human participants as well as those non-human participants. And uh, Patrick brought up the common rule. And it's interesting, I now also serve on the Northwest Indian College's IRB uh, board, and we had a protocol go through, and one of the people asked this question. They said, so, um, why is it that we do this now when before there were no IRBs, we would just go to our elders and ask, hey, can I do this thing? And the reason is that there have been so much unethical research has been done that has harmed tribal communities, that through tribal sovereignty and data sovereignty, they have to protect themselves. And that's where these IRBs have become common in tribal communities. It's to protect the people and to protect the non-human relatives. And before you all got on, even Jamie was telling the story about something that just happened recently that just punctuates the need for all researchers to go through ethics boards, but not just ethics boards that aren't looking at life and ways of being and knowing the way that a traditional Western university would, but they should be looking at it through the lens of tribal communities, tribal IRB systems. Um, Patrick, I'm hoping that kind of added to what you had just said about the common rule and where we are and how this relates to not just research, but people and non-human people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, kind of give you an overhead and coming from a perspective, going to Purdue University where, world-class research is occurring, at one time, like a top 10 research university in the United States. And part of that ethics class, because again, I'm not saying that the ethics that they had taught was wrong, don't mistake that we learned about the 45, 46 CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, something that's built into our legal system and quite entrenched, but that's built upon the Constitution itself, right? Protections of humans, as having these, inherent rights, despite our contraventions throughout history. And so in graduate research, I started to, kind of conduct research. I'd always done, this idea of going to people and, just learning from them and kind of learn what they had to say and, accepting what they had to say because I trusted what they had to say and they usually could show me in reality. Um, and I was really interested because before I'd gone there, going to Haskell, and we did a summer course in Costa Rica looking at sustainable agriculture. My big push at that time was really sustainability and trying to figure out uh, why indigenous peoples perhaps had a different worldview and how it translated to action. And so in Costa Rica, we had gone to a community that was considered carbon negative. And I was really struck because I didn't think that was possible. It didn't make sense. It's like saying, "Oh, I'm negative 20 pounds." It's like that. It's like, what does that mean? What does that mean? And really had being there in place, had seen that, if they would cut down a tree to build a house, they would use a stump as a cornerstone, right? Um, and there was places where they'd had some like landslides and heavier rains, and so they'd had these massive floods. But because most of their housing and building materials were from like, just local, trees or stone, that they simply figured out where the water line was and then just rebuilt above that, but rather quickly the forest was food, you name it. Like even fruits I didn't even know existed. I've never seen again. There was this thing that looked like a tomato, but it tasted like an orange. It was one of the best damn things I've ever had in my life. But again, you don't see this in the grocery store. And I discovered what gave them that kind of negative status is like a lot of land or areas that had been kind of like in a lower succession level ecologically, they had worked to develop these food forests. And so that you had these kind of like uptake scenarios. And then also with that, they were really good about managing, wetlands or areas where you would have like a natural off-gassing. And because they'd go to town to buy like, rubber boots, and nails, like maybe like some, basketball shorts, like didn't really have to consume like at all, right? They had literally everything that they needed to live very well. And that was interesting to me because there was a woman down there that looked exactly like my Aunt Yo. And at first I was like, Aunt Yo, what the hell are you doing down here? But and their word for like kind of how you doing, he was abbreviated like Jasheshkina, and Muskogee, it's a Shtunggo. It's kind of very pretty linguistically close. And then it just I started to realize it's like, oh, we were a tribe that came from kind of, eastern coastal area. Actually we're a nation of nations. So like my people were actually pretty far out in Georgia. Um, and probably from further south than that. And there's always this kind of anthropological, it's like, oh, well, no, these tribes didn't go there because it's like all this forest. And my pushback has always been it's not that hard to figure out boats. You know what I mean? The log falls in the water, it floats. You're like, hey, I bet I could sit on that. One thing leads to another, and then you can navigate the Gulf. Just keep the beach on one side, yeah, and you're good. I digress. But I wanted to understand that concept. And I remember getting into a lab, again, trusting like the advisor that I had, we were on the same page. And she was like, "Oh, do you want to help us with this little study? We're trying to talk to corn and soybean farmers and, do some drought management. And, we wanted to talk to like native or tribal communities." And my first response is like, "Sure, yeah, give me a car in 2 weeks. I'll come back. I'll tell you what they think." And they're like, "Well, no, 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 we have to do this survey and then you have to go through this 45, 46 CFR." And I didn't know what that was. I studied Indian law, but this is kind of like in health and human subjects. It's kind of really tucked away. And and again, it's my digression. I got stuck for 2 years in a lab doing like this corn and soybean study. We didn't get the data. I'll tell you why here in a minute. And I didn't get to actually study what I wanted to because I got kind of caught in that trap of, so anyone said think about grad school, chat with me first, and we'll make sure you don't, so make the same mistakes I did. But this law is a federal human subjects framework. And again, human subjects, big term here. And because it's codified in law, it establishes a baseline. Again, this side is, liability, you could get sued, could lose your job, could get your publications wrote, yada, yada, yada. It's just the floor, but the baseline protection for individuals, researchers, participate in, individuals being studied, participating in federally funded research. And the requirement is informed consent. They have to understand what they're signing up for. You have to have documented, signatory or some other sort of like tangible verification and institutional review board oversight. So each research institution has their IRB, but this was saying like, oh, you actually have to go through the tribes IRB as well. And I was like, really? Okay. And again, the common rule was designed around an individual's, right? An individual's consent. Um, but kind of starts to create this fundamental gap when you're talking about nations, right? So if a tribe as both a community and a governing body decides that they don't want information about, let's say there's like a traditional plant or harvesting area where there could be even just walking through it or something could cause harm to the ecosystem. They're not going to share that data, publicly, but let's say that they just talk to one guy and he says like, "Oh yeah, my grandpa, we used to go through there." Well, because he consented and they published that research, um, then the knowledge is out there, right? And that's one of the biggest challenges is the best of protections you can have if you have like one little way through. And so that's where tribal IRB comes even more into importance. But again, also recognize this only applies to federal research. If it does get into the commercial space, um, the big difference is the tribe could just, sue the hell out of the company, and claim for damages, which still happens. So if you've got a good legal or policy team, go for it. But again, individual consent doesn't address this broader need. And so, as tribes have established their own research review processes, as sovereign nations, they get to define the ways and lenses that they evaluate the research. Now, they don't evaluate the methods or say, well, we didn't quite like, you're not using Scott's pie for your coding analyses, and we would recommend, we don't, that's not our job. It's your job as a researcher to come through with your methods. It is our jobs to understand the ethics, specifically this idea of beneficence. And so beneficence, you think that root like a benefit, it's not supposed to be equivalent. Like, oh, we come in, here's what, we want, and then here's, like a trade-off. So it's a wash. Beneficent research has to provide more for the tribe and the community than it receives. And something that I've noticed over the years is that still in research, because we'll get IRB requests from researchers, and it goes through, say UW, they're kind of notorious for this. It's like, oh yeah, exempt, go for it. We don't care. And we go through ours, and I'm always really meticulous. Pull out the red pen. It's like, no, no, this needs to change now. Ew, no, no. You know what I mean? We'll come to the table, and everyone just kind of like, empties out our cards. We'll ask questions of the research, and almost always this is to improve what they do because it kind of comes sometimes with good intentions. Jamie's a great example. I've seen her research, quite frankly, evolve throughout the years, taking really good lessons and recommendations from the IRB and the tribal community she serves, and it builds upon it, builds upon it, builds upon it. And more than that, the big beneficence is teaching tribal youth to go through an academic system that is designed for them, like the Northwest Indian College or master's programs that have, like, both native faculty and allies that are able to really frame this research. And when they come to us, like one of our last protocols was brilliant. It's one of the most well written, well articulated, grounded fundamentally, beginning with, yeah, it was just, it's one of those things that it's like the type of thing, like, if I could, if everyone does it right, I don't have to be here anymore, and that's my goal, right? Just you don't even need me. But anyway, the the idea of an indigenous data sovereignty is more than just a digital sovereignty or a computational sovereignty or even a sovereignty, say in that commercial sense of like intellectual property, but it's also how data, like who has a responsibility for this knowledge, for this information, and how it's shared, what the context is, who has built those relationships and trust to be able to utilize it, but also where the data is located, right? Because sometimes you don't need the entire data set. You don't need all the geospatial locations if you're trying to figure out, what percent of change have you seen in a region, right? You could just, do the work, share in some kind of managed agreement of sharing, and then take that percentage and and work with that. You don't have to share everything. And I think that's where our role comes into play, because sometimes we'll see people coming through with a survey, and then they'll want to ask like all these additional questions, and we'll be like, well, you didn't mention really needing this data in your survey for anything broad. And they're like, oh, well, we might save it for future studies. I'm like, that's not how we do things here. And quite frankly, they shouldn't do that at UW either. But I'm just, yeah, there'll be better. I have faith. So we'll kind of pause there in terms of like some of the legal liabilities, but then also the beneficent responsibilities that an IRB can help to bridge.
Yeah, Patrick, and I think our time is just about up. And I want to add on to what you were just saying. So, one of the ways that Indigenous IRBs or IRBs that are supporting tribal communities, we're protecting people, right? Just like a traditional IRB might, but we go beyond that. So we're also protecting the community. We're protecting non-human relatives. We're protecting sacred, cultural, and sensitive knowledge. And there are databases that the Maori have created that create context to catalog that knowledge in ways that you can allow the people that need access to it to access it and others can't. And those are the types of systems that get created as we're thinking about Indigenous knowledge and how do we protect it. And I think with that, I'll stop talking and thank you.
So my apologies. I get to rambling sometimes. I do want to leave you with a few final kind of like things to, if you got notes, write these down. So number one, sovereignty is best equated to self-determination, and which applies to the individual, the community, the nation, the nations, and then the even the environment itself. Harm reduction is not beneficence. And something that always keep in mind is when you're doing research in Indian country, you're asking to change people's lives. So recognize that you have a responsibility as a researcher when you're coming into the spaces. And that also sovereignty is not bestowed upon a tribe through a treaty or a legal document. And we have to always remember that treaties were signed in bloodshed. You think about down at the mouth of the Columbia River, the tribes had cannons, and they were using cannons on ships, on entire battalions, and they're like, oh, well, maybe we should like try some peace out. What do you think? And you remember that again, it wasn't just some economic relationship. So sovereignty has legal definition. Yes, but it does not have legal boundary. So sovereignty of self or in tribe is inherent, and then it is articulated into law. Bro.
Thank you,
both
Patrick
so
and Will.
much. So for the next couple of minutes, I think Jamie and I we also don't have slides, but we wanted to talk a little bit about how we have done some of the tribal and academic collaborations. I did also, Jamie jump in as well, but there were a few things that I was taking note of while Will and Patrick were chatting. And one of that, I loved the comment of IRBs are honoring and protecting data, because I think so often people who are maybe new to doing IRBs look at this as like, ugh, more forms I have to fill out, more checking of boxes, when the true intent is how can we do this work ethically and respectfully? Yes, thank you, Patrick. I was reading the chat as well. And recognizing that, I think the other thing that really stuck with me was this idea of having to do two different IRBs. So doing one IRB at the university and then doing the tribal IRB. And so maybe, Jamie, that's where we sort of can start chatting in terms of how we've been able to do it. Because one of the things I've done that before in the past, where I got an IRB at the university, and then I went the tribal IRB, and then we had to combine them. What we've actually been able to do more recently is just do the tribal IRB and then bring that completed IRB back to the university and say, here's the process we've gone through, here's why we've made these changes. And then the university, they have a different legal term for it. I apologize, but essentially they will defer, where they will say like, yes, the tribe knows what is best for their research. They have put this through the IRB, they have approved it, and then they essentially just add their stamp to it. So while yes, we still have those two IRBs, the process is following the tribal IRB process. Oh, thank you, Will. Yes, a reliance agreement. I always forget that. I appreciate that. Jamie, was there anything that you'd want to mention on that?
I think that OSU, it's been great that they're willing to do this alliance agreement. UW is a different story. Each university is different. I think one of our roles as researchers is to continue to push for recognition that IRBs like the Northwest Indian College should actually be able to make the final decision when there are Indigenous communities involved. And to be clear, Northwest Indian College is but one version of an Indigenous IRB. There are many, as Patrick mentioned. Some tribes will ask, what is an IRB when you start to talk about it? Some tribes have very, very detailed processes within their own communities. I've been to some tribes where they look at me and they say, our IRB is sitting down with that group of elders over there for the next couple of months, and then we'll talk. So there's just to say that there's a lot of different ways that tribal IRBs can look. And I'm going to put in the chat something that comes from the Northwest Indian College IRB, just because I think it's really important. Both Will really mentioned this, Patrick did too. These are some of the guiding values. And so when you look at an IRB application from a university, you're never going to see something like this. So I think it's an excellent example of what some of the differences can really be. So something to think about in that as well. And the other thing that I wanted to mention, I'm going to put it in the chat now, and I highly recommend that folks take a look at it. Patrick didn't mention this, and I hope that during the Q&A session he does, but he has spent a lot of time thinking about Indigenous data sovereignty, and he's created this GitHub, which he has generously shared with everybody. I mean, I'm not sure that he sleeps, but it's a tiered data, a sovereignty data framework, which I highly recommend that you check out. It builds on things like the CARE principles, if you've heard of them, the 7 R's of Indigenous research. It builds on all of these things. The work that the UN has done in free, prior, and informed consent. It's a really fantastic opportunity to learn a lot more about Indigenous sovereignty. So I wanted to put that out there too.
One of the other things I wanted to bring up, and this is something we've talked about a lot, but also Will and Patrick, as you were chatting, the idea of, yes, of course, individual consent is essential and necessary for so many reasons, but also framing the research in terms of what does it mean to the broader community. And so that has been, I think, one of the biggest lessons that I have been able to learn. And a lot of that, I can only speak to this experience with the Northwest Indian College IRB. But one of the really lovely aspects when I was doing this was I actually got to sit down with the IRB members and have conversations. And it was questions like, all right, why are you doing this research? And how is it going to benefit? And getting to see, I mean, Patrick, like you said, this changes, like this is people's lives. And I think that brings it so much to the forefront. I had the opportunity many years ago to bring a group of students to speak to an elder. And afterwards, we stood outside for 2 hours, and the elder was speaking about his community. And afterwards, we were in the car, and one of the students had been silent for a while. And then they said, I never realized how important the samples on my bench are to people. Like it was this fundamental shift in how they viewed, like, yes, you have a test tube full of soil or water or whatever it might be, but they understood like it's not just soil or water in a test tube. Here's what that means. But so yeah, going back to the ability to chat with the tribal IRB, I think has been extraordinary. I will also say the tribal IRB has caught potential harms that university IRBs missed. And it was just simply because that IRB understood the context. So the example I can give, we were going to collect some pretty, I will say standard, but standard demographics, but that would include um, age and sex, which in a university IRB, they said, great. Well, the tribal IRB said, yeah, with those two data points, you can identify the person in our community. So you have not de-identified. In fact, you have easily identified people. So of course we amended, but that's just like one small example of how the tribal IRB is going to be able to improve the research and also be able to protect individual and community values and traditions.
Yeah, one super quick comment. So something that I always encourage researchers, they'll come in and even in the consent form, it's very objective. Now, granted, that's how most of researchers are trained. And I will always say them, it's like, look, you need to back up. You need to tell in this, you need to tell people who you are. You need to tell them why you're doing this, right? You need to be vulnerable, when you're asking to also for a vulnerable group of folks, right? And so I think that in the sense is, again, we're not telling them how to change their method, but we are telling them how to approach it ethically, and that's a requirement. But again, it's not something that's simply like saying like, oh, well, this might cause an identification harm. It is that, but again, it's more than that.
Thank you. Jamie, anything else you wanted to mention?
So much, but I think that it's a good segue into thinking about some of the work that Grace is doing with plants, because it's not, particularly Indigenous IRVs, they don't just think about the individual humans, they think about the whole community, as people have mentioned. And it's not just about the people, but it's about all of their relatives. So if you collect sediment samples or tissue samples from an animal, that doesn't mean you don't necessarily need to go through an Indigenous IRB.
Absolutely. Keeping an eye on time, I think, because this is also something that Will, you were mentioning towards the end, is data repositories. And so Grace and Mackenzie are two Oregon State students. They have sort of pulled together some existing data repositories and options. This is not to say that everyone should put data in repositories. I think, Will, you brought up a lot of reasons for why you might not want to. So we are solely sharing information about what exists should people want to put data into repositories, but also understand sort of how these repositories work to help inform those decisions. So Grace and Mackenzie, I'll turn it over to you, and then we will open it up for questions from everyone.
Perfect. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. So today, me and Grace will be talking about tribal specimens, or more specifically, tribal biospecimens. So I want to start by addressing the fact that these are more than just samples, especially in tribal research. These specimens can have cultural and historical meanings. And it's also important to address that historical misuse of biospecimens exists, and it makes it important to have discussions about biospecimens early on in projects with tribal communities. Just to give an overview about what the process of a project that has biospecimens involved could look like, it would start with early discussions about study designs and plans for biospecimens to be collected. Then the tribal community can finalize the decision on where those specimens will end up. That information can then be put into the DMSOA, which is signed by all partners, and then biospecimens can be collected and returned as agreed upon in the DMSOA. So as I mentioned, there are some additional considerations for DMSOAs when working with biospecimens. You should include detailed plans on what will happen with the biospecimens, including things like where or who they will be returned to and the date and time of return. So there are a few different options of what you could do with biospecimens. And there's no correct answer, but I do want to highlight some of the available options. So the first is that the data and biospecimens are returned to the tribal community at a agreed upon time. The second is that they remain with an academic partner temporarily, where they can then be returned back to the tribal community or could be deposited into a repository, which is the final option. And I will let Grace talk to you guys more about repositories.
Awesome. Thank you, Mackenzie. Just reading the chat from Jamie, I'm Grace Gallus. I'm a PhD candidate at OSU in, fingers crossed, my final year, working on data sovereignty, modeling plants, and ethics of modeling and mapping. We have a lot of different options for data repositories, and I will say off the top, not every repository is created equal. So repositories that the NIH has some guidance over. NIH has two different types of repositories: controlled access data repositories. These are more standardized through NIH. So the point of these repositories specifically is that it's a standard access. So the security for each of these repositories is the same on how you would request access for these. The other option are NIH-supported scientific data repositories. These are supported by NIH, but do not have that same kind of security requirement necessarily through all of them. So there may be different requirements and review processes through accessing data on those repositories. They do specifically say that while there is a long list of different types of repositories, you should match your data to what you feel best fits where you would like to store data, even if it's not as specific as you would like it to be. Next, we have these generalist repositories. These are generally considered fairly open access. Some are free, some are not free. They really span a lot of different types of data. Some are specific to different types of data. Many are open to all data. And there's differences in how you're able to access and whether or not they require access agreements beforehand. For some of these repositories, being on them means if you are depositing your data, that is free data for anyone to see. For some of them, there are security measures and access requests. A lot of these are fairly free to use through other universities, but when we're outside of universities, like many people, they cost money. So we want to consider who's using these and for what purposes when we're deciding to use a more generalist repository. On to some more exciting, for me, repositories. We have a newer tribal data repository. It's kind of a long name, our data for Indigenous implementations, Inventions and Innovations Tribal Data Repository, or D4I TDR. This is based off of some work done at Arizona State and Stanford University repositories. This repository system has two different servers, one stored on tribal land, that is their main server. Smart, they do not specify exactly where. There is also a backup server at University of Wisconsin-Madison. This data has not only a place for you to store data, where you should access it and access agreements, but also works with tribes so that each storage is individual to tribes. It goes beyond kind of our standard legal agreements, and they work with tribes to tailor it to what kind of data and how they would like to store it. So though it's beyond kind of traditional legal agreements, these are still codified between tribes and the data repository itself. And then moving on to some sort of collections, another repository is the Native Biodata Consortium. It also uses a similar to the same system as the D4I TDR, but it's more specific to biospecimens. So what Mackenzie was talking about earlier, whereas other repositories might store all sorts of data in all sorts of different ways, Native Biodata Consortium is specific to biodata. And then we have these resource collections. They connect between repositories. A lot of them use these two repositories mentioned above. And they also have things like trainings, workshops, and they work on policy. So the Indigenous Data Alliance and Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance Group both hold workshops. I believe IDA is actually having a conference in April as well for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers and groups that they work with. And they both do policy, they both have trainings, and they both connect you to other repositories and other resources for Indigenous data sovereignty.
Thank you both so much. I also realized we might have forgotten a fairly important concept around the data sharing agreements. I mean, so as Jamie and Will and Patrick have mentioned, like every tribal community that you work with may have a different form of data sharing agreement that they want you to use, but we didn't necessarily talk about the full operationalization. I can't say that word, how it would actually operate once you have that. And I think that's a really important thing. Chance, I know you also deal with this a lot, so you are welcome to jump in if you want. I can speak sort of to my experience and Jamie can speak to hers, but once you have the data sharing agreement, as Mackenzie and Grace said, that is going to go down to the level of what type of data and materials are you collecting. So when I write mine, even if someone is saying like, oh, we're going to show you photographs, well, that's a form of data. And so that needs to be covered by the data sharing agreement. We talk about what types of data, where it will be stored, how long it would be stored, when it, does it stay with the tribe the entire time? Does it go back to the tribe? But we also talk about how it's going to be used, how it's going to be analyzed. And then as part of that agreement, we also talk about what's the process. If someone wants to give a poster presentation or write a paper or give a talk. So in the ones that I've been part of, that's written into the DMSOA that says you need to give your materials X number of days or weeks or months in advance to the tribe for them to review and approve or disapprove what you're going to be doing. So that whole timeline is built in. And then the actual signing of the DMSOA, like, yes, of course, I sign it, my students, my staff, they all sign it, but it is then signed by an authorized organizational representative for the university. So sort of recognizing that importance of that. And Chance, I don't know if you put your hand up because you wanted to mention something, if you're just like, ah, yes. But either way, we're good. Okay. So, but if anyone does have more questions about sort of how we are able to make this a legal document and the importance of that it's not just me, the investigator, saying, yes, I respect tribal sovereignty, and this is how I'm going to do it. But it is actually the full weight of the university saying, we acknowledge this, and this is how we are going to ensure that the research is done according to this data sharing agreement. Yeah, sorry, I'm looking at the chat. I think we have the opportunity. We're on time enough. If people do want to take a few-minute break, just for bio break, grab some water, stretch, let's come back in about 5 minutes and come with questions and comments that you have for our panelists with their wealth of knowledge. So we'll see you back here in 5 minutes. Welcome back, folks.
Thanks for sticking with us.
Yes. And hopefully everyone got some nice stretches and water breaks in. As I appreciate, Jamie is always the one to remind me to stand up and stretch and go drink water. So at this point, you will all should be able to unmute yourselves. So if you would like to just ask a question verbally, I'll just ask that you try and use the virtual hand option, or if you can't figure that out, like I usually can't, just like wave your hand around or drop in the chat that you've got a question. If the idea of public speaking is not something you would like to do, drop your question into the Q&A. And so we've already had 2 people put some questions in that we can talk about. But before we do that, really quickly, Mackenzie, if you're still on, I noticed you forgot to do an introduction. So if you don't mind just briefly introducing yourself to folks.
Yes, sorry about that. My name is Mackenzie Allison. I'm a doctoral student in environmental and molecular toxicology at Oregon State, and I am Cherokee and Choctaw.
Thank you. Okay, so one of the questions that we did have in the chat, I can just sort of start off by reading that, was if any of the panelists could share insights into working with different types of tribal IRBs. So we've mentioned the Northwest Indian College's IRB. Other tribes have their own individual IRBs, and there's also tribes that work through other institutions such as the Indian Health Board. So like here in Oregon, we have the Portland Area Indian Health, or the Northwest Portland Area Indian Health Board that I've worked through as well. So if there are other folks, Patrick, Will, Chance, or Jamie that want to chat a little bit about that question.
And also anyone in the audience, because I can definitely see some names. I know of folks who have worked in the Southwest and do work in the Southwest, where it is very different. And particularly if any of you out there have experience working in the Dene Nation, that would be great to share. That is a very different type of IRB experience.
And I also wanted to echo Patrick's mention of sometimes you mention the IRB and your tribal partners say, IR what? And going through that. But yeah, I have had the opportunity to work with the Northwest Portland Area Indian Health Board. There's definitely some similarities in terms of the broader focus, where it's not just are you collecting data from a human, but what is the impact of that. I would say the main difference for me on that one was I didn't have the opportunity to actually sit down with the IRB members and talk that through, unlike the Northwest Indian College IRB, where I did get to sit down and chat with people. I say sit down, but it was a Zoom conversation that was still very enlightening.
I can't speak to this directly, but there's an organization out there called Primer, PRIMR, and it's for IRBs, and it's about getting training around IRBs and talking about things like artificial intelligence and how that falls in with ethics review boards, which IRBs is. And 2 years ago at the Primer conference, there was a track for native IRB people to attend. So there were multiple training sessions for them. They didn't have it last year. I went to the most recent one, which was in November of this last year, and said, "We'd like to get this back. Can you please bring it back for us?" And so I'm hoping that they will. And I know that in that previous year, there were people from the Southwest, I think the Dene Nation. There were people from, I don't know all of the places, but I think there were 34 represented tribal IRBs at that Primer conference.
Yeah, there was also a paper that came out several years ago. If folks are interested, let me know in the chat. I can find it and send it out. But so a team of researchers actually was able to find all of the various tribal IRBs throughout the US and just sort of talk about like where are they located and sort of the scope of the work that they do. So there has been quite a bit of work to characterize those organizations. But thank you for the comment about Primer. I think I found the right one and I put it in the chat for folks. All right. Another question. In terms of going beyond land acknowledgement, what about the research and data collection that is being done on land not legally recognized as tribal land? Can historical stewards be included in decisions made regarding use of stolen land in a similar way? Yeah, Patrick, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll take this one. So because there is again, the public laws are built on constitutional intergovernmental relationships with tribes, that in many treaties, Washington treaties and adjudicated tribes especially, that it applies not only to within tribal boundaries, but usually in the custom lands. And so technically, and could survive litigation, all data collected on tribal lands is thus the property of the tribe. And so there could be this future where tribes could potentially lease data, and it could be quite a lucrative industry. Uh, so that's one thing to keep in mind. It's like the way we do things now isn't necessarily the way that they will always be done, and a lot of that's probably going to have to happen through the courts, or with proactive negotiations with federal and state bodies, but wouldn't rely on this one.
Thank you. I think Chance, did you also want to address some of that?
I mean, I was just going to chime in real quick. That's something that I've been struggling with ever since I've landed where I am now. Is how do you get the tribes involved in, especially when it comes to like forage management plans and these kinds of things. Especially for the state of Oregon, you've had the removal of tribal communities to reservations it was sloppy and messy. And so what ends up happening is multiple tribes end up should be at the table when it comes to developing those plans. But often people forget that that's what that history is. And so I'm here as a reminder to just say, hey, it's not just us that needs to be making these decisions. We need to get maybe there's a piece of forest just east or west of Portland, where I'm reaching out to 4 separate tribes to engage in conversation about what's going to happen in that space, because ultimately the people that were removed from that space went to different places. And so it's complicated and tricky, but most of the time when you have natural resource coordinators or these kinds of things, they probably know each other already and have probably worked together already, and that helps. But it's a difficult thing to do, but it's something that we do have to do because those people are the folks that have had the longest standing relationships with that space, and they need to be heard. And there's ways to do that, but it takes a little bit of time and a little bit of juggling, but it's ultimately can be done. So yeah.
Thank you. If there are other questions or comments, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask them.
Yeah, I think Will, you had something to mention about AI.
Yeah, AI, as I mentioned when Jamie and Patrick and I got together earlier to talk about today, we brought up AI, and AI can be an entire webinar just on AI in tribal communities. But really, the gist of AI, and we've had AI come through the Northwest Indian College's IRB and recommended that they not use it. And they opted not to based on our recommendation. But when you think about artificial intelligence, these models for AI are based on uh, organizations who are in privileged communities. And the models get created then by iterative uh, input by privileged people, which then create models that hold and contain privileged context. And it leaves out all of the Native communities. And so when a native person then tries to use these privileged models of AI, they're getting back information that doesn't contain the same belief systems that we have within native communities. And so if you are working with researchers who are using AI, I think it's just really critical that we let them know that so that the information that they're getting back they're using in a responsible way and questioning the validity of the information that is returned in their responses. And so there's so much more to say about it, but just in a short little bit of time, that's my comment about AI and just be really, really critical when using it.
Yeah. And something that I think is really important to recognize is that when we're talking about AI, it's really important to understand what we're talking about. There's like large language models, right? And these are the reason they use like the graphics processing units is because they're literally processing instead of 3D, it's 4,096 different dimensions of how a piece of data, as a token fits in a particular inference category. But then you have like what's called RAG, which is like essentially a retrieval system. It's like, oh, I have a bunch of like papers. I just want to find something really quick. And then there's machine learning, which just is kind of adapts to a certain program over time. There's a lot of different applications, but they all have the same fundamental one and zero and data components to how that they're finding information. So if we're trying to actually govern and detail provenance within these systems, right now there isn't really a standard to do that. There's a lot of there's an IEEE standard for governance of indigenous data, also for ethical AI, for ethical design, and all these different considerations that, in my opinion, if you're either an industry or a research institution making over $5 million, you need to have IEEE standards before coming in and to engage and work with indigenous data. But I want to, I'm going to share something with you and kind of tell you a brief story. So there's a big, great fire in like Boston in like 1872, and all the firemen were out and they're trying to go out there, but they realized their fire hoses didn't connect all the hydrants, and that's because they didn't have a standard. So something we're working at ATNI is working, at least in our region first, is to first adopt the standard, but know that it's again not just philosophical. It's actually, and this may be hard to see, but they have this enforcement here that's built into the software. So T0 would be public, like stream gauges or whatever you happen to be. T1 would be in network. Okay, I know this people, I know these tribal members or intertribal orgs. T2 would be negotiated. That's where research comes into play. There's an MOU that's a specific agreement. And then T3 is indigenous data that never makes its way into a network. In case a tribe wants to encode data locally, and there's ways to do that. You can actually write a piece of software that will only work on a very specific processor. It has like a fingerprint, so it'll only work on that one machine, that one computer. So even if you take the data, it's worthless. But what I wanted to show you is that, this is TypeScript. And so you can actually encode these different tiers. So how it used, who has custody rights, what it's traveled through over time, what the provenance source nations are, who's the knowledge holder that's allowed to actually share this thing. But it also has AI and machine learning restrictions built into it. So again, T0, there's a lot of very valid reasons why you could use this in a language system, especially when you have like a lot of data and you need to just understand inference really quickly. Always a default to T3 saying like, oh, you're dealing with this and going to sharing it. No, we're not doing that. But then you also have like, your consent record, throughout time, the scope, all these different aspects of how you would actually encode into a piece of digital data. Now we're talking about maybe specimens or other sorts of like tangible things, but anything that makes it into the digital space, you encode that into it. You convert this into assembly, and now it's inextricable, right? You can try to pick it apart, but you can't like go in there and delete and erase it. It's built in. And this is, I think, the next step for tribal peoples. And also recognizing you can democratize this stuff. Like, this stuff is free. You can build all this stuff yourself. You don't have to hire like a six-figure consultant and buy like, $1,000 a year software to manage this. It's all open source.
Thank you for sharing that. That is fascinating. I am not a coder, but I appreciate how much work goes into coding all of that.
Real quick
Yeah.
note, I'm not a coder, but I know how to copy and paste.
Yeah, I can also copy and paste. I think my issue is I don't always understand what I'm copy and pasting, and so then I don't copy and paste if I don't understand it. But there are some really impressive tutorials on how to learn how to code and what you were doing there. I think we've got time for at least one more question. Another one did come in, and it was, are there specific IRB considerations that you recommend should be considered for local or state governments that are proposing applied research projects with tribes? So would there be anything specific that might be different than projects from academic institutions when you're talking about partnering with a local or state government?
I think this goes back to what Patrick was saying earlier about um, really why are you doing this research? How is it connected to you, right? And I think that if you're doing it purely for gain and not for beneficence to the tribal community, then you shouldn't really be doing that research.
Thank you. Chance, I saw you had also unmuted, so I wanted to make sure you had a chance if you wanted to.
Will just articulated my thoughts. I recently went in front of the Board of Trustees for Oregon State University and got them to pass a policy for tribal engagement. And one of the big thing for me was, we have to think about how the tribe is going to benefit from any kind of engagement, whether that's research or, a service learning opportunity, whatever. The tribe needs to, one, know what they're getting into. So informed consent by the tribe, and also have the tribe know what they're getting out of this. And if this is a purely extractivist research program or project, then I don't want you to do it. It's the previous presidential administration passed all these policies that pushed the idea of meaningful consultation. And philosophically speaking, I love that idea. But also it puts tribes in high demand for consultation, and tribes have different capacities for those things. And so a lot of times I end up reminding people, if the tribe says no, it might not be because they're not interested. They might just not have the resources to engage. And if that's the case, you need to respect that. Maybe now is not the time. That doesn't mean they might not do it in the near future, but respecting tribes' time is crucial. And there's a long legacy of people doing research that only benefited the researcher and not the community itself. Um, it's not just indigenous communities, by the way. There's many communities that have been impacted in the same capacity. So, yeah, just being a human being at the end of the day, I think is really important, and it's really hard for some people to do that for some reason. But gentle reminders, and at the end of the day, it's hopefully this research is going to benefit everybody. And yeah.
One of the other, oh, sorry, go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, something. A lot of people don't know about this, but in Washington State, there's a new executive order. And if you're a university employee, guess what? You're a state employee. And so there is actually required tribal relation training for state employees now, across the board. There's required tribal relations training for governor staff and cabinet agency directorate, and understanding like literally what tribal consultation is. Um, but like a big piece of this too, I don't think people are ready for this. They have to develop a evaluation structure to see how effective that state employees are engaging with tribes. And again, I don't think a lot of folks know what that means. Some researchers might, but I am really curious to see what happens with this. And I guarantee you, considering how many state employees are in research institutions, like even the coach, that's kind of cracking me up. That's like a story in its own, are engaging in research that now this has to go through it, as well as the kind of board directors that are realizing like, oh, these little clauses in the university, it says all data is the property of the university. Those are going to have to be modified. I don't know if they'll go away, but.
Thank you. We are coming up on time. One of the last things I want to mention, because we have been approaching a lot of this from like the start of a collaboration, start of research, and as everyone has been saying, make sure the research is benefiting the community you're working with. Going back to once you have a DMSOA, and I talked about how you need to be submitting everything for approval, if that's a presentation, submitting an abstract, whatever it might be. One of the things that we haven't mentioned, and I just want to sort of plant that seed, is in order to make sure that the research is beneficial, you have to report back that research to communities. And every tribe will have a different process for how you do that. That may be presenting to communities, that may be giving data back to your individual study participants, but making sure that that is also written into your data sharing agreement, and that is also part of your IRB proposal, or going through that full process of how will we make sure this information is given back. And my personal opinion, a peer-reviewed publication is not sufficient way to report information back. So I strongly recommend that we can go beyond that, and that you do so in consultation with the people that you are working with to ensure that the information is relevant, that it is culturally competent, and that it is truly giving that benefit back to the community you're working with. With that, I know we are just at time. I did see some comments and it looks like Patrick has addressed some of that. We will be trying to compile a lot of the resources that have been shared. For any questions that we feel like we might be able to address a little bit more with resources, we'll compile that as well, and we'll send that out via email. We are also going to put in a short evaluation survey. This is the first time we've done this. We are hopeful that it was helpful and useful, and if we can continue doing this, we would like to. So I know everyone gets a lot of evaluation surveys, but I do implore you to fill it out honestly so that we can use that information to improve future offerings. So with that, thank you all so much. Chance, sorry to put you on the spot. I don't know if you wanted any final wrap up comments.
No, just thank you all for being here. I think there'll be some follow-up. And I honestly think that this is a conversation that's going to continue. This is something that's constantly changing and shifting, and we have to strategize around those changes. So I hope to continue this. I believe this is the first time we've had this particular webinar. I mean, we might think about doing a follow-up because, like I said, these things are going to be continuing. So thank you, Diana, for all the work that you've done, because I know a lot of work went into this. And thank you to our guests, Patrick, Will, thank you for joining us. And thank you all for listening and paying attention. And yeah, let's keep aspiring to do better.
Thank you, everyone. And also thank you to Jamie, who is 13 hours ahead of us, or 9 hours. Either way, it's a lot. So I appreciate you joining in your very late evening.
Thank you,
All right,
everyone.
thank you, everyone. We will follow up with an email. Have a lovely day.
All right, take care, folks.
Cool. Sean can stay.
Yeah. I do have another meeting starting at 11:30, but
Okay, I just wanted to say thank you. I thought it went really well. I definitely think we should reach out